Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm creating a festive vintage style Christmas card using some of the brand new Tim Holtz Sizzix Christmas 2025 dies and embossing folders. Don't worry if you don't have these exact supplies. I'll be sharing easy substitutions and techniques so you can create something beautiful with what's already in your stash. From inky embossed backgrounds that shimmer and shine to textured greenery and a classic deer focal point, I'll walk you through every step to spark ideas for your own holiday card making. Now let's get into it. So for this project, I'm going to be working with some of the new dies from the Tim Holtz Sizzix Christmas 2025 release. Now these are some dies that are kind of back from the vault. They're classic Tim Holtz dies that were brought back as the original. So there's no changes or anything different with these. So if you happen to have these dies already in your stash, then you're good to go. So you certainly don't need to go buy anything new. And if you don't have them, obviously, for those of us that didn't get them the first time around, this is an opportunity to maybe add some that you were wanting to get to your collection. So it's just an opportunity for those of us that didn't get these the first time around to be able to add them to our collection. That said, please feel free to substitute with anything that you might have that's similar, whether it's Tim Holtz or some other brand. So I'm going to be working with the Merry and Bright die set, the mini holiday greens. This has long been a favorite of mine, and I did actually have the original one of this. I'm kind of glad to have two of them now because then I can kind of cut more than one at a time. So again, though, super excited to have that one back because it is definitely a favorite. And the other thing I'm going to be working with from the new release is the Engraved embossing folder. These have been resized to the A5 size, so they're much larger than the original embossing folders. So if you do have the smaller one, you certainly don't need the larger one to create a card with. The only thing this does is gives you the option to make a larger card size or project because of that larger embossing folder surface. I'm also going to be using a long retired die. So this is the Dashing Deer Bigs die. I was super lucky to find this earlier this summer when I was out shopping with a friend of mine. So I was, like I said, super excited to find this. And for the sentiment on the card, I'm going to be working with the Tiny Text Christmas stamp set. Obviously, you could use any sentiment stamp set for the card. If you don't have the holiday greenery or you don't want to purchase this new, go through your stash. You've probably got some greenery pieces that would work. Same thing with the sentiment piece. And if you don't have the deer die, again, just kind of go through your stash and see if you've got similar silhouette type shapes that you could use. Another option would be to use the new Winston re-release, or a snowman, or another deer die, or maybe a Santa. Any kind of a focal point type image could work to replace the deer for this card. Throughout the video, I am going to go over substitutions for many of the supplies that I'm going to be working with. Now some of the mediums I'm going to be using, I've got some distress ink here in Frayed Burlap and ground Espresso. I've got some embossing ink and some embossing glaze in Frayed Burlap. I'm going to be using some distress paint. I've got black soot and Lumberjack Plaid. I've got glossy accents, a glitter duster filled with some rock candy glitter. I also have the distressed snowflakes, which are a combination of glitter and mica flakes. And I've also got the grit paste snowfall. That said, I will be going over some substitutions for all of these supplies in the video when I'm using them. So the first thing I'm going to do is take a piece of watercolor cardstock. You can use any kind of heavier cardstock. I would definitely recommend something that can handle different mediums because we're going to be using a combination of ink and embossing and luster wax on this. So you could probably get away with just a regular sheet of kind of thicker cardstock if you like. I just always prefer to use the watercolor cardstock. And then we're going to take the engraved embossing folder, and I'm going to take the Frayed Burlap Distress ink and rub it over the surface of the top of the embossing folder. So when you're looking at the embossing folder, that the side that has the print on it, when you open it up, I'm going to apply the ink to that side of the folder. Now, if you want to use a different kind of ink, you certainly can. I'm just rubbing it over the surface. You might want to try to push down a little bit so you can kind of get it down to all the cracks and layers, especially with these 3D embossing folders. There are multiple layers to the design, so it's not flat, and you just want to make sure you get ink onto all of that raised area. And like I said, you can use any kind of ink you want. If you wanted to use oxide inks, if you wanted to use a pigment ink, or if you wanted to use some other kind of a dye ink, you certainly could. And then before I emboss it, I'm going to spritz the back side of the paper with some water. You don't want to spritz the front side because that's going to activate that ink, especially if you're using a water-based ink. So I'm going to spritz the back side of the paper. I'm going to do that off camera here. Just give it a few spritzes of water, and you kind of see it there. And then we're going to place that side down on the embossing folder. So if you're using the watercolor cardstock, I'm putting the smooth side up, and I sprayed the non-smooth side with water. And then we're just going to close the embossing folder and then run this through our die cutting machine. And just depending on whatever machine you're using, you'll just need to sort out which is the best configuration of plates and all that you need to work with. Now this is one of the new A5 embossing folders, so they're much larger than the regular embossing folders. So they do have a new cutting plate that is larger than these. You can use a regular size cutting plate, but you're going to have to kind of shift it a little bit, and you're not going to get the entire plate embossed because it's literally the exact same size. And then you have these little lips, and you have to have a little bit of space, or the machine, or it won't go into the machine. It can't grab a hold of it. So that's where this larger size plate comes in handy. But if you don't have it and you've got some of the new embossing folders, you can certainly use your other one. You would just need to run it through maybe a couple times, just shifting that plate. So now I'm just going to run this through, and that pressure from the machine embossing is going to transfer that ink over onto our paper. So there you go. Isn't that beautiful? So if you don't get as good of an impression as I got, it probably is just you just didn't get enough ink onto the folder. So you could, if you're brave, re-ink the folder and place the paper back in and run it through another time. Just want to make sure that you get it lined up and it doesn't shift on you or anything when you run it through. Now at this point, you're going to want to make sure you dry the ink. So you can set this to the side to dry, or you can use your heat tool and just dry this real well. Because for the next step, we're going to do some heat embossing. And any ink will, if the ink is wet, the embossing powder or embossing glaze is going to stick to this. So just kind of want to keep that in mind as the reason why you want to give this a really good dry before we go on to that next step. So for this next step, if your paper got a little bit warped, you can just kind of give it a little bend here and there and kind of flatten it out. And then you're going to take your embossing ink and you're going to just rub that lightly over the surface here. So this time you're not wanting to really push down so much. We're just wanting to hit the highest raised areas on the design here. So just kind of lightly rub it over the surface to transfer some of that ink over onto the design. And now we're going to take some embossing glaze. I'm going to be using the Frayed Burlap. You could use any kind of embossing powder at this point. If you wanted to use a colored embossing powder, like, you know, a brown or a gold or whatever you would like. This is a translucent powder, so you can see through it, which is just going to give it a lighter color than like using more of like if you had a solid brown embossing powder that you were going to use, or if there was a color underneath this besides white, it would kind of change what the color looks like as compared to putting the powder onto something white like we're doing here. And as you can see, that powder hopefully is mostly sticking to just where you put the embossing powder or the embossing ink. And we're not looking to get the entire pattern or design embossed. We just want to hit those raised areas. So if you do get some down in some of those lower sections, you can just grab a little paintbrush and wipe away some of that if you want. It's kind of really up to you how much of it, if you want to remove any, you certainly can. I got some areas here that I definitely got more on there than I wanted, so I am gonna brush those away. But if we hadn't dried this, the whole thing would be coated with the embossing powder because it would have stuck down into all those little cracks that we definitely don't want it everywhere. But again, it doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, I've got some areas on here that I maybe would like to have some embossing powder, but it's all good. All right, so we'll just put that excess powder back in the jar. And then now we're just going to heat emboss this background using the heat tool. So I'm just going to turn that on, let it warm up for a few seconds, and then start applying the heat to the powder here and keep the embossing gun moving while it's melting. And then once you see the powder starting to melt and get shiny, then you can just move on to the next area. So then once everything is heat embossed, you are ready for the next step. Now at this point, and even before this, if you didn't want to do the heat embossing, you could certainly skip that step. The next step we're going to be doing is adding some gold luster wax. And this is just going to add a little gold metallic shimmer to the surface here. And I always like to wear gloves when I'm working with the waxes, just to kind of protect my skin, and a little bit easier to clean off a glove than getting it off my skin. So I like to dip my finger into the wax and then kind of rub it around in the lid. You could also rub it around if you're working on a craft mat. You could rub it around on the craft mat. And I do that just to kind of get a nice even coverage on my finger there. And then you're going to just rub that lightly over the surface. Now, again, I'm not going for solid coverage, so I'm not going to look to rub it over everywhere that I just put that embossing glaze. So if you've got some areas that maybe you missed, definitely hit those. And like I said, just here and there. And if you need a little bit more, go back and grab a little more. But it just adds another layer of interest and detail to the project. This is certainly a step you could skip. You could get a similar kind of look if you just wanted it all gold. You could just do like a gold embossing powder instead of the embossing glaze. So lots of options. And just continue adding that over the surface until you're kind of happy with how it looks. If you want more or less, just kind of keep playing around with that. But if you can kind of see that interest that it adds there. at this point, we're just gonna set this to the side and let it finish drying. The wax doesn't take super long to dry, but once it does dry, it'll be permanent. So as far as cleanup on your craft mat, you can just use like a little bit of rubbing alcohol. That'll clean that off of there. But if you do get it on any other surfaces, you do want to make sure you clean that off before it dries, or it's going to be on there permanently. The finished card here is going to be 5 by 7. So for the base, I've taken a piece of Kraftstock or craft colored cardstock and cut it to 5 by 7. And then I have a piece of white cardstock that I've cut to 4 3/4 by 6 3/4. So then we'll cut this down to 4 5/8 by 6 5/8, so that you'll just have a tiny little border with this white cardstock and then the craft cardstock. But we're not going to leave this plain, and we are going to add some inking to the edges of this. So we will get to that here shortly. So I've cut down the embossed panel now that everything's dry, and the final step we can do here for this background is just to add some inking to the edges. And to do that, I'm going to use a little bit of ground espresso distress ink. You could use any brown ink that you like, and then whatever blending tool, and then I'm just going to apply that around the edges here. Kind of working in a circular motion, kind of holding this at a little bit of an angle. Pull that ink up onto the paper. And you might notice I kind of start off the paper on my craft mat here and then kind of pull that ink as I'm going in that circular motion. I'm kind of pulling that ink up onto the paper. So it just gives it kind of a nice soft blended edge. And if you want to work it in a little bit more into the middle a little, you can. Kind of up to you there. And so with that, our background is finished and we're ready to move on to the embellishments. So off camera, I'm going to do some die cutting. I'm going to die cut the deer head from some craft cardstock, and I'm going to cut it twice and adhere those 2 layers together just to give it a little bit more stability. And then I'm going to take some custom colored panels to do the die cutting of the greenery. These are pieces of distressed watercolor cardstock, and I've sprayed them with distressed spray stains. So this is peeled paint on these 2 here. This one is shabby shutters, and then this one is forest moss. And literally you just take a piece of watercolor cardstock, spray it with the spray, add a little bit of water if you like to kind of get the ink flowing around, and then let it dry or dry it with your heat tool. And then you've got custom colored cardstock for die cutting. If you want kind of that vintage look, you could also use solid colored cardstock. You could just ink blend the cardstock and using the ink instead of the sprays. Lots of options for creating colored cardstock. I just like creating with these particular colors because I love working with the distress palette, and that way I don't have to try to find cardstock that matches exactly. And I'm also going to cut the word bright from some craft cardstock as well. I'm going to cut that a couple times, and I will adhere those together, again, just to add a little bit of stability to the die cut word. All right, so I've got all of my die cuts cut and ready to go. And now I'm going to just start working on adding some details to them. And first up, I'm going to do the deer here. And I'm going to mask off his kind of head a little bit here. So I'm just going to cut a piece of mint tape. You could use like a masking tape if you like, and just kind of create a little area here that I can kind of mask off and keep the ink from getting onto anywhere that I don't want it. So I wanted it to have a little bit of a roundedness there, so added a little trimming to do that, but you could certainly just keep it straight across. And then I'm going to use some ground espresso and just a little blending foam and just ink this up here. And then just a reminder, I cut this from 2 pieces of craft stock that I'm going to glue those layers together just to make this a little more stiff. So we can just peel off that little mask and kind of see what we got there. If you want to add a little bit to it, you can. Kind of gently there. And then I'm going to ink the edges of the deer, just very lightly. Here with my kind of the leftover ink from inking the antlers. And you can kind of do as little or as much of that as you like. There we go. And then the deer is ready to go. Now we're going to move on to our different greenery pieces here. And we've got quite a few options of things you can do to add some interest to these. So several options you've got for adding the berries to the die cuts here. You can use a red glitter, like the Pops of Color or Nuvo drops, or if there's like if you have a red Stickles, this is give you a little glittery shimmer, which I like. You can also take just a plain red Pops of Color. This is Rudolph Red. And then while this is still wet, you can add some glitter to that and then just let it dry, and that'll add a little sparkle similar to the glitter Pops of Color. Another option that you can do is if you've got just some paint, you can paint the berries with some acrylic paint, let that dry, and then go over those with some glossy accents, and then while the glossy accents is wet, you can add the glitter. Another option, you could do the paint and then like a clear glitter Pops of Color or Stickles or something like that to get kind of a red sparkly berry. And if you don't want them sparkly, leave off the sparkle and just do them with just the plain paint, glossy accents, or the Pops of Color. This is the fastest, of course, because it's all mixed and ready to go for you, but you can also do, like I said, any of those other options. What I'm going to do is paint the berries with some Lumberjack Plaid acrylic paint. Like I said, any red paint will work. And then once that's dry, I'll add the glossy accents. And then while that is wet, I'll spritz it with the rock candy glitter using the glitter duster. Now to add some shimmer and shine to all of these, you've got some options, whether it's using the rock candy glitter. This is just a glitter duster, so you can like spray the glitter on. You can also use the Distress mica flakes, or you could use the new snowflakes, which is a combination of the mica and glitter kind of mixed together. So you can kind of use a different combination of things there. And then as far as helping the glitter or the mica flakes or the snowflakes to stick, you can use glossy accents. This is my favorite to use for adhering any kind of glitter type stuff. You can also put down some grit paste. There is the grit paste Snowfall, or just the translucent grit paste. The grit paste Snowfall is translucent as well, but it has a little bit of glitter in it, not a ton, so I usually still spray it with the glitter duster to give it a little bit more of a snowy effect, but this will add a little bit more texture than if you just do the glossy accent. So I like to just get a little bit of it onto my palette knife and then just kind of randomly put it down here and there on the die cut. And you can kind of do that with any of these. That's however much you want to put on there. Kind of thinking about it, landing on the branches. And then while that's still wet, I'm going to take the glitter duster and spray these over the trash can with the glitter just so that I don't get it all over my workspace here. And then from there, you're just going to set this to the side, let that paste dry, and this will be ready to go for your card. So I'm just going to repeat that glittering on all the rest of these die cuts. Now you can also do that same thing with these snowflakes. So like you just kind of give that a little shake. And then instead of using the glitter duster for these, Just put them over onto like a piece of printer paper or something, and then just pour the snowflakes over it. And so this is going to give you kind of that combination of the mica flakes and the glitter, so it's going to make it even a little bit more chunky. And of course the mica shows up a lot, you know, right away because it's a bigger piece of shine to it there, but just it'll give you just a little bit more even of that snowy looking effect. So got some options there for how to add some shimmer and shine to your pieces. Now I'm just going to add some glossy accents to these berries. And then while that's still wet, I will spritz that with the rock candy glitter. And then I'll just set that to the side to dry once I have all the berries glittered. Now while we let the greenery dry, we're going to create our own custom black Kraftstock. Now I don't know about you, but I absolutely love the black Kraftstock, and it used to come in a pack all by itself. That has been discontinued, and so now you can only get it in the neutral pack of Kraftstock from Tim Holtz. And well, there's only like 4 sheets in there, or 5 sheets or something, so that doesn't last me very long, and I'm running out of my packs of just the black. So I tried to come up with a way to make my own, and this seems to have done the trick. So the black Kraftstock is literally just a piece of craft colored paper that has black printed on one side of it. So then what I've done to recreate my own, kind of a DIY, I guess you'd say, I've taken some craft cardstock and I'm just using some black soot distress paint. You could probably use any acrylic paint would work. And I am going to just paint the cardstock with the black paint. So I'm just going to use a little brush here and just cover over my die cut. And what I like about the Kraftstock papers are that you can sand over them and reveal that craft core. So you're removing that kind of top layer of color to reveal that craft core underneath, and it just gives you a really cool distressed effect. And I personally just really like that look, and specifically with black. I'm not sure why, but that color seems to be my favorite one to use for lots of my projects. So I was very sad when I found out it was being discontinued. And then don't want to forget the little dot on the eye, so I'll paint one of those. And then I have my extra one here, and I'm just going to leave that to the side, let this dry, and then I'll adhere those 2 layers together to make it more substantial. And then this is going to be that back layer of our card, the bottom layer of our card, and we don't need to paint the whole piece of paper. You're just going to see the outside edge of it, so I'm just going to paint the edges of it because the center is going to be covered with the rest of our background panel and that other layer that we're going to have on the card. And then from here, you're just going to let these set to the side, let that paint completely dry, and then we're going to do the next step to give them that distressed effect. So now we have our DIY black Kraftstock. So here's the original. Here is the one that we made, and really can't tell a whole lot of difference. They're pretty similar, especially using the black soot distress paint. Now what you're going to do is take a sanding disc. So that's just a piece of light grit sandpaper. So you could just even have a piece of sandpaper from the hardware store. And I like to put down some kind of paper. This is like a packaging insert, just to protect my work surface so I don't sand off anything. And then you're just going to rub that sandpaper along the edge of that cardstock that you painted. And you're going to sand off some of that paint. And that just gives you kind of a worn, distressed effect. Just work your way all the way around the edge of the background piece. And you can sand as little or as much as you like, kind of to your preference there. But you're going to notice that you get kind of a bit of a dust everywhere, so you can grab something to kind of wipe that off. Clean that up a little bit so you can kind of see if you have enough off of your paper. And so that's kind of where we are with the sanding there. And then you're going to do that same thing with the sentiment piece. Now, this can be a little bit more tricky. So just to kind of protect it, I've glued it together with that second die cut, but you can kind of pop it down into the negative and use that to kind of help hold it in place. But I still kind of like to use my fingers and just kind of hold it as I'm rubbing and kind of rub away from where I'm holding so that I'm not kind of less likely to tear it that way. And then like I said with the other piece as well, like you just sand it to your desired level of grungy. And then again, just give that a little wipe off. And then there is a look at our distressed sentiment piece. So then the final step for the card itself is just to take that other piece of white cardstock that we had and just ink the edges of that with a little bit of ground espresso distress ink. So if you just want a real light edging, you can just kind of rub it along the paper like that. If you want it to be a little more ink, you can do that circular application that we did on the other background. So it's really just kind of up to you how much ink you want on there. Not a lot of this paper is going to show because of the sizing that I'm using here, but so that'll layer onto that one, and then that will layer onto the black panel that we created, and then that is the base of the card. So you can just use whatever kind of adhesive you prefer to glue those together. And then from there, you're just going to assemble the rest of the pieces. So your deer and your greenery pieces, and then you adhere your die cut sentiment, and then the Making Spirits Bright is just stamped onto some white cardstock using some black soot archival ink, and I inked the edges of that and then used a little bit of foam tape to pop that up on the card. If you remember earlier, I mentioned about switching out the deer for a different focal point image, and so this is just Winston. You could cut him out and use him and add the bright there. And maybe instead of doing red berries, you could do pink berries, but then you can just tuck in the greenery around Winston here and use him on your card. You could also do a Santa, kind of go through your stash and see what other kind of like focal point images that you could use to embellish the card. You wouldn't even necessarily need to do something with the greenery. You could just, follow along and create the background for your card and then embellish it however you like. So I hope this has given you some ideas on how to use these new dies and the embossing folder from Tim Holtz and Sizzix that are part of his Christmas 2025 release, but also that you've gotten some ideas on how you could possibly use some supplies that you already have in your stash so that you're not having to go out and purchase all the things. Here's a closer look at the finished vintage Christmas card. I hope this inspires you to dive into your own stash and mix in some new favorites and experiment with substitutions to make the techniques your own. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribe for more crafty inspiration, tips, and techniques. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay crafty, my friend.